Welcome, Dayna. Good to meet you.
I'm happy to be here. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. And I got your name from a colleague of yours, Nicole Williams. I was on retreat with Nicole, and we were having lunch with Krista Tippett, of all
Yes.
people.
Yes.
And Krista was so excited about biomimicry. I got really excited about biomimicry.
Mhm.
I think I'm already into biomimicry because I'm a beekeeper, bee guardian. So already
Uh-huh.
it's influencing my life and how I view the world. And Nicole said, well, you should talk to Dayna Baumeister. So here we
Mhm.
are a few months later, and I'm so
Yeah.
excited to talk with you about this concept of
Oh, that's
biomimicry.
great. I'm really glad that you got to meet Nicole, and as well as Krista. Yeah, she's recently discovered biomimicry through a podcast that she did with my co-founder, Janine Venias.
So let's start with just what is biomimicry? Let's describe that concept, and then we're going to go deep into it and actually apply it to things like our psychology.
Sure, happy to. So, the definition that we use is the conscious emulation of nature's genius. And we actually chose those words pretty carefully. So, conscious implies there's some intent. It's not just that you happen to do something and then you go validate that in by finding something in the more than human world and say, "Oh, look, nature does that too." But you're consciously emulating. You're looking for, seeking, asking for help from nature's genius. And the genius recognizes that life has been around for 3.85 billion years, and has been working through and figuring out a lot of things. And the emulation piece is that we're not copying nature, but that we're really trying to understand what those best practices, those lessons, those patterns are, and then how we might apply them to our world. And that application could be tangible things, how we design cars or buildings or cities or products. But it could also be intangible things, which I'm sure we'll talk about more here today. But, how do we communicate? How do we collaborate? How do we build networks? Um, the things that also are critically important for how we run and design our world.
So you use the word genius, which is the word of the moment for me because I'm
Mhm.
writing a book all about genius and that we also have geniuses within us. We're also part of nature. Humans are part of nature as much as
Absolutely.
we
Mhm.
separate ourselves from nature. What is your particular genius in being able to start to unpack this concept of seeing the genius in nature? Like,
Mhm.
how has that arisen for you personally?
Well, I've always lived in what I call the interstitial spaces. I've never fit in one particular discipline or another. My undergraduate degrees were in chemistry and biology and fine art. And then I studied resource
Ooh,
management. And I was never satisfied in any of those. I was like, there's got to be some place where I can live, where I can work with my love of nature, my fascination with how nature works, and apply that to making a better world. And so when in 1998, Janine's book had just come out, and I read it when I was in grad school, and I was like, this is it. This is the answer of a way to learn from nature, learn about nature, but learn from her in a way that is in service of creating conditions conducive for all of life. And it had a design element, right? There's a strong design element. When I do the Clifton Strengths Finders, my first strength is ideation. So I definitely bring that to the table of not just being, I think, pretty good at translating those lessons, the biology, but then immediately saying, okay, and this is what we could do with it, right? This is how this might manifest, and cooking up those ideas for how we could apply those lessons in our.
fantastic. So give us some examples. Start with some of the ones that are, like solving some of humans' problems, like, making a bullet train faster or like Velcro, how you've used nature's genius to help some of our human problems like that.
Yeah, happy to give a couple of just sort of classic examples that help get your head around it. You mentioned the bullet train. It was called the bullet train because it moves as fast as a bullet. It's now called the Shinkansen, because it no longer actually has the nose that looks like a bullet, but the nose of the train now looks like a kingfisher beak. And the problem that the Japanese were facing is, as these high speed trains would go through tunnels, they would create such a pressure wave in front of the train that the air couldn't escape fast enough, right, basically, as it pushed through the tunnel. So when that air came out the other end, it created a sonic boom. Not so wonderful for the people living in the villages around those tunnels. And so it needed to be addressed. And one of the engineers on the project happened to be a birder. In the evenings, he'd go down to the river and observe birds.
Mhm.
And the kingfisher is a bird that essentially has to do the same thing as a train. It has to dive from one density of air, of medium air, into another density, water, without creating a wave. Because if it creates a wave, it will scare the fish that it's diving in afterwards, or towards. So the engineer said, well, what if we put the shape of this kingfisher beak, which is so good at piercing this different kind of medium from air to water, without creating any ripples? What if we put that on the front of the train? And sure enough, they did that. The sonic boom was eliminated. And it turned out that
Wow.
it also improved fuel efficiency by 3% for the rest of the time. So another win on that front. Another great example, and only because it's pertinent, this morning at our house, we heard a couple of birds unfortunately crash into our window. And that the ever-ending challenge of windows that look reflective, they give us an opportunity to look outside. But then when they reflect in a certain way to a bird, it looks like an endless forest that they can keep flying through. So there's a company in Germany that developed a product called Ornilux. And they asked the question, well, how is it that a bird can fly through a forest and doesn't fly through spider webs? How is it that, what is it about spider webs that protect themselves, right, from birds ripping them apart? And it turns out that spiders weave into their web a very, very small strand of silk that reflects ultraviolet light. And birds can see ultraviolet light. So while a spider web may appear transparent to us because we can't see ultraviolet light, birds can. And so it looks solid to a bird. So they now Ornilux embeds these ultraviolet reflective fibers into glass for windows so that to a bird, it looks like the solid part of the house as opposed to the reflective window that looks like a forest. And, like 99.9% improvement in efficiency. And so really important for high rises and big buildings that are especially in bird flyways. So these are the kinds of things where we
Wow.
ask nature, help, how do you do it? And then how can we apply it to our world?
There's a couple things going on there because in both of those examples, not only are you, solving a problem, you're also making it more efficient with this solution because nature's so efficient. Like nature doesn't waste any energy and it has this like greater benefit. It makes me feel so bad about all the spider webs that I walked through this morning and cleared my path that maybe I should be
Well, the
ducking
spiders have a
under
lot of
them.
effort. That's right. And
Yeah.
what's interesting about nature is it is efficient, but it's also effective, right? So it has to be effective first,
Mhm.
but it can't afford to be effective at the cost of efficiency. And so there's always an optimization process going on for all organisms that are figuring out like what's the highest degree of efficiency while being effective and maintaining resiliency. Right? Because, of course, we've moved into a world where we're so fixated on efficiency that we lose resiliency. So when there's a disturbance, we're like, so the fastest way, the most efficient way to ship our goods is through the Panama or the Suez Canal, which is wonderful until a big ship gets log jammed in the canal. And then suddenly we can't get goods anymore because we've focused so much on efficiency. And so life is constantly balancing all of these factors in order to have survived for
Yeah.
3.85 billion years. Yeah.
Well, as you're talking about efficiency and effectiveness, people are, of course, thinking about that in terms of their own work life. And I think we can, transition to some of the psychological impact of this because when I got back from that retreat, I was texting with Nicole. She's the director of your
Oh, no,
Biomimicry
very more.
3.8. I was texting with her and I was like, how's your reentry going? Because it's
Mhm.
such a huge transition to be
Yeah.
on retreat and then travel back from Europe and re and she sent me this quick little article on how nature adapts to things.
Uh,
She's like, I just look to nature for every single solution that I
right,
have.
right,
How am I going to adapt to change? I just look to nature for answers. So tell
that's
us a
right.
little bit about that. Like, what can we learn from nature about things like transitions, whether
Mhm.
it's someone's transitioning out of a marriage or transitioning to a new job or just transitioning to a time change. I'm sure nature can tell us a little bit about transitions and adapting.
Well, yeah, and I think probably it's a lot of times when we want to look to nature, the best and most insightful aha comes when we keep digging deep. We go deeper and deeper and deeper. And so if you look at something like transitions and why they're so challenging for us as a species, it really actually does come back to our psychology, and our psychology is grounded in the metabolism of our brain. Right? So our brain is hugely expensive to run, and as any species, you're talking about efficiency again. You've got to like lower the metabolic cost of running this brain. And one of the ways to do that is our brain is actually not a calculator. It's not constant. It's actually not a computer. It's really just running an algorithm, a predictive algorithm all the time, because an algorithm is much lower cost metabolically than to constantly compute. And those what we call them cognitive biases, but really a cognitive bias is nothing more than the algorithm that helps me lower my metabolic costs. Right? So
Mm-hmm.
as part of that, we want our algorithms to be accurate all the time. We want them to be good predictors. And part of being a good predictor is if you have stability in your life, you have some consistency in your life. I know that every morning when I get up, A, B, C, D are going to happen. Or when I encounter someone, this is the kind of experience that I will have. I don't have to constantly be assessing friend or foe or threat or concern. Um, and so we like stability. Our brains like stability. Evolutionarily, we've been around for 300,000 years. And while there certainly was a lot going on in the ecosystems and the habitats and the things that we had to manage, our brains did not evolve for modernity, right? And so modernity is like really hard on our brains. And so we're craving this sense of stability. And then a transition comes and we're like, what do I do with that? Right. So we panic around all of that. And we try to build systems in our lives that create some stability, as opposed to like from day one telling a narrative and a story that we live in a dynamic world. Right. And what does it look like to move through that world? We call it being round. And the way I like to think about it is if you take a bowl and you put an object in the bowl, um, that bowl is actually never holding still. As much as we would like it to hold still, it's never holding still. So what we do in our worlds is we build things square. We build our objects, our things, our lives square because we assume the bowl will stay still. But the bowl's always moving. And so what life does is life is round. Life is like, okay, I'll just roll wherever it goes in the bottom of the bowl. And our human strategy is to invest a lot of energy into holding that bowl still. And then you get some big disruption like COVID. Oops, we couldn't hold that bowl still, right? Or a typhoon or, some other disaster. And we're reminded that we can't put enough energy into the system to hold it still. So life's way of dealing with transitions is to always be in a state of roundness. Be like, okay, I've got designs built in that I can be adaptive to that.
Well, it makes me think a lot about my bees,
Mm,
which I do not own. The bees that come to our yard, that come to our top hives, because what happens there is part of the natural progression of bees is that they grow and they build their hive and they build and build and build and then they get too big for the hive. And
mm,
so they will hatch another queen when they're too big, and then either half of the hive will leave or sometimes the whole hive will leave, and I'll be sitting in my office here, doors open, and sometimes I'll be with a client. the hives are not far from my office, and you'll see this huge swarm
Oh
of
yeah.
bees, thousands of bees flying by, and there they go. And for me as a human, there's a part of me that wants to go catch them and bring them back,
Oh yeah. Yeah,
you know?
right. Like that's my
But
known world. I know this world.
that's my square,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
And as opposed to letting them go, we actually did a great job because it meant that the bees multiplied and half of them left. Oftentimes people will call us from town and they'll be like, there's like a beehive right next to the school. And can you come down and help move it? And we'll be like, sure, we'll come take your hive. But
Mhm.
this is the natural change that just happens and that species know how to work with it. They're like, roll with it. Yeah, you're right. We have such a hard time with our big
Mhm.
brains
Yeah.
being able to be flexible with
Yeah.
change and to even see it through that lens.
Yeah, and it's learned, right? It is a learned
Yeah.
behavior. In fact, there's some studies that were done that looked at creativity and ranked different cultures, populations around creativity around the world. And it turns out that people that have grown up with change their whole life, especially in what we, I guess we can refer to as the developing world, that had moved from into modernity really over the last 30 years. Think about the changes that those populations have seen. Their brains are much more like, yeah, we got this. We can be creative. We can come up with all sorts of ideas. We can see all sorts of possibilities. We're not so fixed. Whereas in the United States and in much of the industrialized world, we've been kind of fed the message of, don't worry, the Cheerios taste just like when you were a kid, right? Like
Mhm.
this idea of stasis and, let's keep you comfortable. And for all practical purposes, while it may feel jarring to us, it hasn't changed that much in America relative to other
Yeah.
places in the world.
Yeah. Well, this is sort of that distinction between homeostasis and allostasis, right? Like the homeostasis to go back to where we were, where everything stays the same, which, yes, our body is doing that. But also allostasis has more to do with adapting and changing with the stressors that come our way.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
You have to hold them in balance. You have
Yeah.
to recognize they're both important. Yeah.
Right, exactly. So tell us a little bit, give us an example from nature that you look to when you're under stress and you're like, oh, okay, I just need to remember the blah, 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 because that
Mhm.
is what is such a
Mhm.
good symbol for me of how I could handle my stress.
Well, I can't say that there's a single organism, right? That and in
Mhm.
fact, when we apply and think about lessons from nature for our human kind of what we call social innovation, sort of in this intangible realm, we try very hard to not choose single organisms because
Hmm.
that can be it's really more, again, it's a little bit validating. We might go out and be like, oh, I'm a bee and today I'm the queen bee. Like, I mean, we just sort of can make up
Well, that feels good.
stories around that.
Yeah.
Um, and so for me, it's more about gaining perspective when I'm stressed. Like usually stress is
Mm.
you've lost perspective and grounding. So in fact, I actually had a very stressful day yesterday. And so going out into nature and just being like, you know what? Trees are still standing, the birds are flying, they're blowing gently in the breeze. Like let's get real about what's real, right? And sort of stepping back from that, taking the really long view,
Mhm.
is super powerful. I mean, we're just blips. We've even 300,000 years is such a small fraction of how long life has been thriving on this earth. And for me, at least, that's what I do. So I look at the deeper patterns and the deeper messages when I think about
Mhm.
stress and what that looks like to be living in accordance with the flows of the more than human systems.
I loved in a talk that you gave where you described all these other species as our elders.
Hmm.
And that we've only been around, you said, just a tiny amount of time. I think in the talk you used the analogy of a year. If it's been a
Yeah,
year since the world has been around, that humans have only been here for like, what was it, like 24 minutes or something of that year,
exactly.
and that all these other species have been here so much longer, and that is part of their wisdom. Like they've been around, like our elders, right? And
Great.
that when we're stressed and we go out to, for me, it's always the oak trees, 'cause that's what I look out on every day. We go out to that oak tree, or even, to something small, like something crawling in the ground, right? Or one of those spider webs. It can help us to see that, like, you've been around longer than me.
That's right.
And then we don't feel it doesn't feel so important, but also there's a support. There's
Uh-huh.
a groundedness
That's right.
to that.
That's right. We're not
Yeah.
alone. We're not alone. And
Yeah.
we don't have to figure this all out by ourselves. But we do have to quiet our cleverness. And we have to be willing to recognize and see that those bees or the spiders or the birds or the trees, that they actually have something to offer us. They're not commodities. They're not things that are just there for our consumption, and our use, but they're fellow travelers on this planet with us. And yeah, there are elders for sure. And
Mhm.
I mean, there's at least 30 million species on the planet. There could be up to 100 million. We've only given names to about 2 million of them. So you can just imagine what there is, that we're I like to think of it as we're toddlers, but we act like teenagers, right? So we act like we have all the answers when we really don't have a freaking clue, but that's how we act. And we really are toddlers. We should be asking, "Hey, elders, how do I live here? How do I figure this out? What does this look like? Give me some answers," right? As toddlers do all the
Mhm.
time. Why? Why, mama? Why, papa?
So there's these 2 owls that sit across this canyon that I'm in, and at night they talk to each other.
Mm, mhm.
And, I'm going to bed at night and I hear one owl and then the other owl, and my husband and I just get such a kick out of this, of listening to these owls talk to each other at night, and then here we are, in bed together talking to each other, and then the little owl. It's just very sweet, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there's something about that which is about communication, what we can learn about communication from nature, because nature is such a good communicator. I mean,
That's
we go
right.
back to the bees because, again, the waggle
Uh-huh.
dance or whatever it
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
bees are such communicators, and that we can communicate effectively without language.
Mm, mhm.
Um, and so tell me a little bit about that, like what we can learn from nature about communication
Yeah.
and effective
So, I mean,
communication.
communication, of course, it's a signal, right? It's a form of feedback. It's a form of signal of not just communicating with someone or another individual of your species, but also communicating with the landscape, communicating with other species, and picking up signals, right? That's all forms of signal and communicating. We like to call it, in that feedback loop of matching signal and antenna and response. And
Cool.
and recognizing that there needs to be a fit between the signal and the antenna. And all too often, when we humans communicate, we're like, it's that classic, like the love language, right? We tend to offer love in the language that we want to receive it in, as opposed to recognizing the antenna of the person that we want to convey that love to. What do they want to receive it in? So we're kind of lazy about defaulting to our own antenna when we send a signal. But it's a mutual responsibility to say, okay, it's really important to me that I get a signal out to you. In which case, I need to design my signal to match your antenna. Or it's really important to me that I pick up a signal. So then it behooves me to design my antenna to match the shape of the signal that's coming out there. Okay.
Oh my gosh, this is
And
the next couples therapy session that I'm gonna do. This is so fantastic. Looking
yeah,
at our antenna, that's
yeah,
that mediating
yeah.
role between signal and
An antenna.
response.
That's
Wow.
right. And if you don't have the signal antenna match, then it's just
Yeah.
like communication just randomly going out there, and not it's a waste of everybody's time and energy and effort. And then, of course, what's the concurrent response? Does that response is it appropriately attuned to what the signal was and how it was received by the antenna? And whatever that might be. And I think, yeah, when you have couples that have been together for a long time, tomorrow, my husband and I celebrate 28 years together, and um, you learn about what their antenna is. But even that, even after 28 years, it's like, okay, no, that did not work. I did not say it the way that I wanted to say it. I know you better. I know what your antenna is. And so it's a constant practice. And I mean, that's the beauty of these systems of in the more than human. They've evolved to get really, really good. So all those bees, they didn't just fly off and go, where are we going to go? There were scouts that had been out for days checking out possible new nesting sites and then coming back and in their waggle dance, both showing the direction of the potential nesting site, the quality of the nesting site, and the enthusiasm with which they waggle, is an indicator of how much they want everybody to join them. And then there's ultimately a consensus building that happens, so like some of the scouts are like, okay, your waggle's a little bit more enthusiastic than mine. Let me go check out your spot. And then they waggle together. And then eventually you've got enough of a quorum that everybody's like, okay, that's good. We're going that way. And then so they already know where they're going before they've taken off.
Right.
But that's a very fine tuned antenna signal and response.
Yeah. So bees teach me a lot about trust as well.
Mhm.
And I'll go down and visit my beehives on my break between clients. It's one of my favorite things to do. I don't put on a bee suit to go down there. And part of the reason why I don't have to put on the bee suit to go down there is because there's a couple guard bees that stand right outside the opening of the hive. And these little guard bees, they if they get bothered by me, they'll come let me know. Like
Mhm.
I'll be down there and if I get like one or two bees like circling around my head, then I know, okay, they're asking me to leave now.
Uh-huh.
And it's a very gentle, like, loving ask because they don't really wanna sting me and die. They don't wanna, like, rip their innards out with
Mhm.
the stinger is connected to their I think their intestines in some way, right?
Yep.
Bees don't have intestines, to their stomach.
Mhm.
Um, so they'll circle around me and they'll tell me, "Okay," and then they'll follow me back up my path,
Mhm.
and then when I get far enough, they'll leave.
Mhm.
And to me, some people may consider that like, "Oh, that's scary." To me, that is trust. Like, we've just developed a little trust with each other that, I'm not coming down to harm you, and also you're gonna tell me when you feel like you need for me to move on, and I'll listen to
Mhm.
that, and
Mhm.
I'll move away.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about trust
Yeah.
and what nature teaches us about trust that we could use in our own lives.
Mhm. Well, it's a great question. You're asking perhaps just a tad bit premature. And the reason
Mm,
I say that is we've been engaged in a very deep dive to ask that exact question. What can we learn from nature about trust? And over the last 6 months or so, we've been researching. And again, it's not looking for individual examples, but what are the patterns across all of these species? And of course, trust is a mental model, right? It's something in our head, and we can't go inside the heads of all these organisms, but rather we can witness um, the behaviors that look like there is an engagement around which there is some trust, right? And then try to understand what is it that's going on that allows for that interaction to be trusting. And this is a project was actually funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. And we are doing the research, and then we're working with a cohort of health equity leaders who are going to take these principles and apply them to their work in the world. And so we've been refining the principles. We've come down to about 8 of them. And from that, there'll be a documentary and then there'll be a toolkit that we'll share with the world. So it's just a bit premature, but I can give you a little bit of a sneak peek. The first principle, well, we kind of bucketed the principles in the categories of the phase of kind of establishing trust, like figuring each other out, growing that trust once you've sort of gotten past the initial phase, and then maintaining trust, right? It's not just like once we're there, we're done. We have to keep maintaining it. And, nature doesn't fit in neat boxes. There's all these overlaps, and it also makes it difficult to even parse it down into 8 principles. But the first principle is what we're calling willingness. And in establishing trust, both parties have to be willing to be there And that willingness is a calculus between risk and benefit. What are the benefits of engaging? What are the risks that are, engaging in this potential relationship? And those benefits have to outweigh the risks. And that calculus is based on current circumstances. It's based on past experiences. It may be past experiences with that other entity or past experiences that have nothing to do with that other entity. But we're constantly doing that calculus. And it might just be 5149, but if at least it's 5149, then there's a willingness to be like, okay, I'm going to sense into this and see what might happen. What's interesting about that is in times of great stress and scarcity, our calculus might be very different. It's kind of like, boy, I don't have any other choice. I am in such bad situation. I'm just going to have to trust you because otherwise I'm going to die. Right? So we see that in nature. Or in times of great abundance. Well, I can trust you because if I'm wrong in my calculus, I'm all right. I got a cushion. When we're relatively comfortable, we don't tend to want to take those risks, right? Again, that brain algorithm, like let's take the lowest path. And so when you're like trying to establish partnerships with another individual or maybe organizations wanting to work together, and you're like, why can't we get these organizations to come on board? Well, they might just be comfortable. You haven't made a good case for what the benefits will be over the risks. And you can't tell them. They still have to do their own calculus. So the lesson that comes from there is like, what would it look like to actually have a conversation around what do you see as the benefits and risks of this engagement? Here's what I see as the benefits and risks of this engagement. Can we like address some of those? Are we accurate in our assessment in order to get to a more willing place? Right?
Well, there's also how to create some of those stressful situations to support trust. This is why I think wilderness programming does so well, right? When you
Yeah.
when you have kids that I participated in wilderness programming as a kid. I was struggling with my mental health. My parents threw me out into Outward Bound for a couple of sessions, and that you're going to have to learn how to trust a whole lot quickly
Yep.
when you're in nature and you have such limited resources and you're depending on each other to get
Mhm.
to the next camp or find your way. Things like rope courses. I mean, we're kind of artificially creating stressors to boost that
That's exactly.
willingness.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My advisor for my doctoral work actually developed a hypothesis, which he proved by going around the world with us. Was called a facilitation stress gradient. And he looked at pairs of different species of plants and how they were helping each other out or not, and went up the sides of mountains, went over an elevation gradient in mountain ranges all over the world, and found that as the conditions got more harsh, the more likely you were to see plants cooperating and plants taking care of each other. Of course, we don't want to create a ton of stress unnecessarily, but you can create like a micro context where if you're trying to encourage to in a team building situation, you can create these micro contexts where a little bit of that sense of might at least get people over that hurdle to be willing to be like, hey, maybe this colleague at work who I think I don't like, but now I got to trust them, and they turned out to actually have my back. That like gets through that first batch of it, and then you can move on and keep cultivating some more of the other principles.
So there's like two more areas I want to talk about before we get really concrete on like how people could start doing this today,
Awesome.
observing nature and
Yeah.
looking to it for answers. Uh, One is what nature can teach us about, I guess the word I want to use there is like the subtlety of life.
Mm.
Um, because we live in such a, I mean, I feel like everything is very over, like big stimulation, big responses. And nature sometimes is quite subtle and slow and quiet and measured in its responses. This comes to me from my son who is really into horseback riding and very emotionally sensitive, and the what he's learned from riding horses about his own self. I
Mm.
mean, the other day he was telling me about he calls it the buck meter. He said, the horse will tell you.
Mm,
It'll tell you for a long time that it's going to buck you off. Like
mhm.
it's been telling you for like the last 20 minutes that it's
Right.
going to buck you off. But you have to pay attention to its body.
Hmm.
He's like, you need to pay attention. The buck meter gets a little bit ticked up if you notice that it's starting to tense or it won't
Hmm.
quite go when you're asking it to go. And if you don't pay attention to those messages and you don't adjust, then eventually it will get to the place of bucking you off. But we're so used to just the getting to the end of that buck meter,
Right. Mhm.
that we don't pay attention to the subtle
Yeah.
cues.
Yeah.
And nature has so many subtle cues. And we humans, part of nature, have subtle cues too
Right.
inside our own bodies. And
Mhm.
we're giving each other subtle cues. So tell me a little bit about that. I don't even know what word I'd want to put on it. Maybe it's just attunement, like what
Mhm.
nature
Mhm.
tells us about attunement.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think part of it is, yeah, we've gotten, trapped in whatever the rat race or even the all the marketing of social media and whatnot, of course, is tapping into our amygdala, right? The amygdala, the pleasure center, which is like, oh, feed me, feed me, feed me. And to the point where that signal is overriding our prefrontal cortex. It's like, wait a minute, I don't have time for you to be stimulated right now. Like I need to slow down a little bit and I need to like take care, right? Be more attuned. Um, and it is, I think it's a byproduct of the context. And you take this context of this world that's like, go, 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 be productive, do all of this stuff. And we're also the other big driver for us is that we are a social species. I mean, we survived for 300,000 years because we lived in community. So we have so many adaptations that ensure we don't get ostracized, we don't get kicked out of that community. So you put this context of this social pressure of perform or engage or do likes or whatever it might be on this other adaptation of don't get ostracized. And we get trapped into that message to our own detriment, right? That's really doing a number on us. And so the big message is, I think it's a Nigerian who said this, the times are urgent, we must slow down. And I just love that way of thinking about, in fact, it's a personal motto right now. Like, why am I saying yes to so many things? Like, if you cannot be attuned, you cannot, notice the horse is about to buck you. If you're just like, I got to get home in time for dinner because if I don't get in time for dinner, then I'm not going to be able to go to the movies and blah, 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 like, or whatever it is, whatever story we
So
tell
you're so
ourselves.
focused on where you're headed, you don't pay attention to what's right underneath you
Right.
that's giving you signals right now. Like
Exactly.
that's here, whether it's your kid that's wanting your attention
Right.
or your spouse that's in bed next to you, but you're so thinking about what's happening tomorrow.
Yeah.
And that's the danger of the horseback rider, right? Like they have to pay attention to their horse because the
Mhm.
horse is what's going to carry them there.
That's right. That's exactly. And our
Yeah,
bodies are what are going to carry us into the future, and our
right.
community and our family and our people are going to be critically important. And if we don't pay attention to those, and that's why we have this huge epidemic of loneliness, and we've got this epidemic of anxiety, and like you just name it. And it is, I believe, it's that critical tension between the context of this consumer-based world and the biology of our brains and how our amygdala works and how we need to stay in community. And so we follow the crowd. And those two
Yeah.
things are not serving us, not serving us well at all.
Yeah. That's why you find the director of the biomimicry program at a retreat center.
Yes, that's right. Yes,
Slowing down.
that's right.
Um, okay, so the last question I have about nature is sort of a big one, which is what nature can teach us about dying.
Mm,
When my dog died, my favorite dog of all time, Shanti, and we named her Shanti because Shanti means peace. So every time we chanted her name, every time we called her, we're saying peace like a
mm.
thousand times over.
Yeah, yeah.
And Shanti, she went when she was dying. She didn't tell us that we didn't really know that she was dying. But one day she just walked down to her garden, and I found her down there, and she was so like kind of lifeless. She was wagging her little tail. And there was something about the way she died, carrying her, being with her in her death that was so peaceful
Mm,
and so loving, and like there wasn't fear.
mhm,
It was like it was just a transition,
mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And, I think nature does dying a lot better than we humans
Oh,
do.
definitely. Yeah. That's so true. And especially we humans in the, the modern industrialized world, are, and I think some of it comes from the decoupling. We just don't spend enough time in nature to see death and decay and notice that, oh, that tree died, but then look what came out of it afterwards, right? Look at what it supported in its passing. And we can't even, our English language doesn't even talk about cycles very well. Like, you read a textbook and it's like, the water cycle begins with a cloud dropping rain, right? Like, we can't even, we suffer with this ability to see the things are in flow, and are cycling. And so part of that is just recognizing that flow and that dynamic, and not wanting to hold the bowl still. The same thing. Our fear of dying is part of that, like wanting to hold the bowl still. And perspective taking. I think a big part of, moving so fast, losing sight of where we are, how this all fits. Last weekend, I was with my grandmother, who's 108. And it's been very, very fascinating to spend that time with her, and she's ready. She's ready to go. She's like, I don't quite understand. Well, I'm still here. I don't get what this is about. And all she's done for the last 50 years is watch people die. She makes a friend and they die, and she goes to another funeral. And but when I think about her, and I think about, like, when she was born, like, it was the old crank telephone. Right? And I mean, what she's watched, satellites, two world wars, like, I mean, it's just, and when you step back enough, I think we can hold more space for that preciousness. And maybe those two go hand in hand, in terms of being more attuned to now, recognizing how precious this moment is. And as we step back and look at the larger space of things, knowing that it's part of these cycles, right? These cycles of life that we move into. It's all a story. It's just a story we tell ourselves, and we can choose to tell ourselves a different story.
Mhm. Thank you. So, if folks they're inspired by what we've been talking about, and they want to be part of this. Like, they want to learn how to bring more biomimicry into their life. Maybe they want to do it academically, like they want to go and read some research that you're mentioning, or they want to do it in a more experiential way.
Yeah.
Give us like maybe three things, three ideas of directions people could go.
Well, I'll do them in order of sort of engagement, right? The degree of engagement. So, and ease, perhaps. The first, just go outside. Like, just go outside, and instead of, like, hopping on your bike or powering through, a run, just, like, see if you can change the pace at which you engage, with some sort of ecosystem, whether it's your garden in your backyard, or maybe a local arboretum, or the path down the road to a park. What does it look like to step out of the human pace, the human scale, the human antenna, the human perspective, and just start engaging, right? Like, just that piece alone, like tuning that part, is a great start. And opening, and wondering, well, how would nature solve this, right? That's accessible to anybody and everybody.
That's your WWND. What would nature
Yes.
do?
What would
Agree to
nature
that.
do? That's
That's good.
exactly right.
Yeah,
That's what my license plate says. WWND.
that's
Um,
awesome. Yeah.
then, if you want to, dig in and start exploring more, probably the easiest and most kind of, like, delightful place to go is our website, asknature.org. And there I mean, be prepared to go down a lot of rabbit holes, because there's so much cool information on there, and lots of resources, and, this information for teachers they can use. And that's really our most public facing. That's through our nonprofit, the Biomimicry Institute. And there's a lot to explore. There's a children's CD that's got fun music and all of that. And of course, it's in the much broader space. And then if you're really, really engaged and you really want to dig in, I mean, we offer week-long immersion workshops, and I teach a master's degree in biomimicry. So if you really want to dig in, at Arizona State University, you can really, really get engaged. And what's really cool about that program is I've got people from all walks of life. Like I've got, of course, I have engineers and I have designers, but I have business people and I have doctors and I have lawyers, and I've got people that are interested in sustainability and people that are interested in social. I have this one gal who's like, how can we redesign our prison system? Nature doesn't have prisons, but nature messes up all the time and makes mistakes. So how, how does nature deal with that? So there's it's really amazing how people can engage with the lessons and bring them back to their world. So
Fantastic. Well, at the beginning of the show, I asked you what your genius was, and you said it was sitting in these interstitial places,
mm,
these spaces
mm.
between all of these different ideas, right? And I really saw that genius in you
Oh, thank you.
today, as you had no idea where I was going to take you. I had no idea where we were going to go. We just went there,
Yeah.
and it was really fun. I felt your genius alive here,
Oh, thank
and
you. I appreciate
I'm sure that others did as well. And they're going to want to go dig deeper and go into nature, but also learn more from nature and from you. So
it.
thank you, Dayna
So
Baumeister.
much.
It's been a pleasure and delight to get to know you.
Oh, I'm happy to be here. I'm glad that you ran into Nicole. Here we are.
We're all connected. Okay, take care.
Take care.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Wise Effort podcast. Wise Effort is about you taking your energy and putting it in the places that matter most to you. And when you do so, you'll get to savor the good of your life along the way. If you would like to become a member of the Wise Effort podcast, go to wiseeffort.com. And if you like this episode and think it would be helpful to somebody, please leave a review over at Podchaser. I would like to thank my team, my partner in all things, including the producer of this podcast, Craig, Ashley Hyatt, the podcast manager, and thank you to Ben Gold at Bell and Branch for our music. This podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only, and it's not meant to be a substitute for mental health treatments.